The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Yesterday, I told you that tensions were rising in Ferguson, Missouri after the killing and the shooting death of unarmed teenager Michael Brown at the hands of a police weapon. We now realize that the claim that tensions were rising was one of the biggest understatements that we could have possibly imagined. The demonstrations have entered their fourth night, and I guess in some way this is now the fifth day. Pictures, online reports, journalists are being arrested. Tear gas has allegedly been used, including near-on journalists. It is unbelievable, Lewis, what is going on there.
Journalists getting arrested seems like there's another line that's being crossed. If they're trying to cover what's happening here and the police are making it harder for them, I don't see how that's helping the situation. The
two journalists were Huffington Post's Ryan Riley as well as the Washington Post's Wesley Lowery. They both said they were taken into custody at a McDonald's restaurant where reportedly police entered and indicated that people had to leave. And according to what we heard from the journalists, they were not packing up and leaving quickly enough. They also, one or both of them, started filming what the police were doing. Remember, these are journalists. This is press. And it's amazing, Lewis, because when you think about tear gas, which is not supposed to be used, period, being used in the United States, you think about how press are treated in what would ostensibly be far more dangerous and harrowing circumstances in other countries. And press seem to be mostly okay in many of these cases. Of course, we can think about situations where they're not. And journalists being arrested at a McDonald's in Ferguson, Missouri. We see the extreme militarization of the police. 70 SWAT team officers and a tank standing opposite protesters. According to an MSNBC reporter last night on the Lawrence O'Donnell program, they were told by authorities, by police, that this is no longer a peaceful protest and people must disperse or they will be arrested. And it's not even clear how they are to disperse. The journalist yesterday, and his name escapes me now, on the Lawrence O'Donnell program, saying they've created a line which makes it impossible for half or more of the protesters to even go back to their homes because they would have to cross this line that has been established by authorities. It is amazing what is going on. And all I can think of, Lewis, is the kid glove treatment of Cliven Bundy and his core of buffoons and how they were treated with respect and deference when they were showing up there with weapons pointed at federal agents. And here we have what is by and large a very agitated but nonviolent protest, and the SWAT team shows up with tear gas?
There's something to be said about how the media spins things, and there's also something to be said about race here, I think.
Yeah. And Lewis, I was just reading a report yesterday about some of the corporate media bunglings on the reporting of this story. Looting, for example, right? When you see, first of all, looting is racially tinged, period. It is far more likely to be reported when there is looting surrounding a protest involving minorities. But the incredible thing is that the looting appears to have been going on at the same time as these protests, but not by the protesters. In other words, with police and thousands of people at the protests, looters took the opportunity who had nothing to do with the protests to start looting. Of course, you never really hear that specificity when you see the reports on corporate media.
Oh, of course not. It's a perfect opportunity for looters, and it makes perfect sense. Same thing happens whenever there is a major disaster that strikes, a weather disaster. It's always the same thing with looting.
We have a new witness now in the killing of unarmed teenager Michael Brown on CNN. Two witnesses told CNN that there was a tussle between Michael Brown, the victim, with police officers before he was shot dead. But the claim by police that Michael Brown in any way entered the vehicle, either through the window or door of the police officer, is not part of the story that's being told by any of the three witnesses now. We have women's accounts that corroborate the previous witness. We now have three witnesses saying that the officer fatally shot the unarmed teen. Listen to some of these details. We have here Tiffany Mitchell, who told CNN last night, "It looked as if Michael was pushing off and the cop was trying to pull him into the car." Mitchell said she drove to Ferguson on Saturday to pick up an employee for work just in time to see Brown tussling at the window of a police vehicle. She and an employee, Piaget Crenshaw, told CNN's Don Lemon about the last moments of Michael Brown. Crenshaw, still in her building, watched the events from her window. She later shot cell phone video of the aftermath. "It looked like the two were arm wrestling," she said. Neither woman, who gave statements, by the way, to St. Louis police, said that they saw Brown enter the police vehicle at any time. Instead, a shot went off. The teen reportedly broke free. The officer got out of the vehicle in pursuit. Here's a quote from Crenshaw, and this is incredible if it is true. "I saw the police chase him down the street and shoot him down. Then he faced the officer, put his hands in the air, but the officer kept firing," both women said. He then sank to the pavement. Lewis, we now have one witness who I mentioned yesterday, whose story has been consistent throughout, and we now have two more witnesses whose stories are consistent with that first witness. As always, we want to wait until we have all of the facts. What that means is not completely clear in this particular case, but certainly we see a level of consistency among all witnesses that should make us all very, very concerned.
I am at this point about 99% sure that the situation is just as we thought it was when we first heard the reports about it.
Anonymous is now getting involved in this. And as you know, Anonymous has the internet gathering, the hacktivist collective known as Anonymous, was involved in the following up of an exposure of Amanda Todd's bully. Anonymous was involved in the exposure of the Steubenville rape case. We now have Anonymous issuing a statement regarding this situation involving Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the killing of unarmed teenager Michael Brown. Here is a little bit of the video that was posted by Anonymous, including some of their demands to local authorities.
"For this reason, Anonymous will not be satisfied this time, as we have in the past, with simply obtaining justice for this young man and his family. Anonymous demands that the congressional representatives and senators from Missouri introduce legislation entitled Mike Brown's Law that will set strict national standards for police conduct and misbehavior in the USA. To the good people of Ferguson, take heart and take your streets. You are not alone. We will support you in every way possible. Occupy every square inch of your city. Demand justice. Staying silent today could result in the death of your kid tomorrow." To the Ferguson Police Department and any other jurisdictions who are deployed to the protests, we are watching you very closely. If you abuse, harass, or harm in any way the protesters in Ferguson, we will take every web-based asset of your departments and governments offline.
So it turns out that indeed Anonymous has activated, Lewis. Number one, the Anonymous group has reportedly been confirmed as hacking the City of Ferguson website. All city emails reportedly were down for a period of time. I don't know if they are back up. I have a crazy story from Seattle in which an African-American Seattle man who just happened to be walking by a protest was pepper sprayed by essentially a mall cop. It was a security officer. This is just unbelievable. We have some video of it. There's an African-American Seattle man who happened to be walking by a pro-Palestinian protest, and he still says he has no idea why a security guard pepper sprayed him instead of a white man who was harassing demonstrators and yelling racial slurs. Freelance photographer Alex Garland photographed and videotaped the incident. We see here this picture of the victim. I don't even know what to call him here. He certainly seems to be a victim, 26-year-old Raymond Wilford, being pepper sprayed by this, essentially a mall cop. He said that he was walking through this protest. There was this white guy who was shouting epithets like towel head and sand nigger. Wilford said that he was trying to avoid him and go around him, and that the individual approached Wilford, and you can see in some of these pictures that they almost look like they're about to get into some kind of physical altercation. Then a Westlake Center security guard arrives on the scene, and with very little hesitation tells Wilford to stop. The white guy, who was the instigator, still yelling and walking towards the security guard, but for some reason the security guard's mace was pointed at Wilford. Eventually, he pepper sprayed him. Let's look at a little bit of the video of the immediate aftermath here.
Get your hands off him. It was the other guy that was coming with us. He didn't do what you're doing with him. Hey,
You just fucking maced the wrong guy, man.
Yeah, you maced the wrong guy!
That guy's the wrong guy.
I saw this. You did not do anything.
Yeah, I said it.
Let go of him, please.
Don't. Hey. The fuck did you mace the black man for? Are you kidding me?
Well, they certainly should do an internal investigation, Lewis, of mall cop procedures. That'll certainly teach this guy, won't it?
This story is so incredible. Of course, we're talking about someone who has even less training than your average cop, and those regular cops still mess up on a regular basis. But I mean, if this happened to me and a mall cop, who I know was not an actual officer, and who I know didn't have a gun, maced me for no reason, I think I'd probably get violent. I'd probably have to try and defend myself from someone who's trying to harm me for no reason.
Maybe you would. Wilford did not get violent, and later the security guard told Seattle police officers when they eventually showed up that Wilford, quote, took an aggressive step towards him, which subsequently led to the pepper spraying. The good news is that this guy, as Lewis said, is a mall cop, so the chance of justice being done is probably higher. I'm just glad that the mall cop didn't have a gun or a taser.
I was just going to say that. I think if he had a taser, it probably would have been that. And if he had a gun, maybe he would have mistaken the gun for the taser or the mace or vice versa.
Truly some incredible stories in this first segment today. We're going to continue following these stories. We will have plenty more on this. We will take a break. We will be back with more right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is your best source for unbiased news because no matter what liberals say, if we allow same-sex marriage, the obvious next step is men marrying giraffes and women marrying motorcycles. If that sounds unbiased to you, go to liberalbias.com and find out more. Today's new member of the day is Mark Gordon. Mark, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. As you may have heard me say before, this program is mostly funded by individual viewers through the membership program. If you enjoy the show, if you've been a freeloader for a long time now, or even for a short period of time, that's okay. But if you can afford to support the work we're doing, go to davidpakman.com/membership. I have a film recommendation for you today, which I have to admit originally was mentioned by producer Lewis on the bonus show. I subsequently watched this documentary, and it is excellent. It is called Tiny, A Story About Living Small, and it's about people who try to minimize their consumption and their footprint by building really, really small houses. Sometimes these houses are built on the backs of little trailers, which legally makes them exempt essentially from property taxes and the like. It's very, very interesting to me, not because I would ever really consider living in such a tiny house, but because the idea of minimalism and that people just become accustomed to using and living in and taking up much more space than they really need. I think it's interesting, Lewis, how these people really show that you don't need as much as you probably have.
It's a totally different way of life, and I agree with you that I would probably not want to live in a 250 square foot home.
Or even way smaller. I mean, in some cases, it was more like 120 square feet.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes smaller. But it is fascinating. And just from a construction and technology standpoint, it's interesting to see how they can cram everything into these tiny spaces.
Yeah, that was actually one of the more interesting parts of it, which was these were often hipsters with no building experience whatsoever, and they went through the process of learning how to actually build. Oftentimes, it took 2, 3, or 4 times as long as they had imagined. But a very, very interesting film. Again, we are talking about the documentary film Tiny, a story about living small. It's available on Netflix. It's available elsewhere. Lewis, how would you rate this film?
Like out of 5 stars or a 1 to 10? What?
You tell me. You create the scale and rate it.
Out of 5 possible stars, I give it 4.5 stars.
I would give it a 4. That's exactly what I was thinking. 4.5 stars, which is equivalent, of course, to 9 out of 10.
Yes, that's true.
All right.
But I prefer stars.
A man has been violently attacked for standing up for women who were being catcalled. The man is now in a hospital. 39-year-old Texas man, whose name has not been released, was visiting Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square over the weekend. Police said that he observed a car full of men pull up to a group of women, and according to NBC Philadelphia, the men inside the Nissan car began taunting and catcalling the women. According to investigators, this prompted the victim to get involved. The male victim took offense to something that was said, and he said, "Hey, watch what you're saying." This led to the men getting out of the vehicle, punching this guy once in the head, which knocked him unconscious. He fell and hit his head on the concrete. Police say the suspect's Nissan had Delaware license plates. They're looking through surveillance video to see if they can identify the license plate number. This story, Lewis, is so representative of multiple layers of problems with society. One, of course, is just the hair trigger predisposition to violence that exists in many people. That's one issue. That's not really the issue I want to talk about right now. Think about this. Some men are so irrationally fixated on the need to publicly demean, shame, and control women that they're willing to just beat up anybody who even tries to get in the way or suggests that maybe they're not acting in the right way. It's an incredible point of view.
I don't understand it, but I guess everyone has their own needs and their own joys, I guess.
This actually does say quite a bit, though, about the motivations behind a lot of the catcalling, which is obviously not about striking up a conversation with a woman that might lead to a date, right? Because any reasonable individual knows that that's incredibly unlikely to happen. And I've asked a lot of women in New York City, this is a big problem. I've asked a lot of young women, are there any circumstances where a situation that starts with a catcall could lead to you going on a date with that person? They all said, of course not. I mean, I just keep my head down and try to walk away when that happens because I don't know if it could lead to violence. The real motivation behind the catcalling is about men exerting dominance, because if it were about trying to get a date or create a relationship with the woman, you wouldn't need to beat up the guy who points out that you might be acting inappropriately. It is all the same, and it is about exerting dominance.
I guess at the root of it, it would be insecurity or something similar, because that's just what those types of people do.
A lot of young women I know here in New York City say that they've learned to be completely non-reactive to this, right? They walk by and someone yells something and they've learned to not even flinch. You don't look over. You don't speed up, but you certainly don't slow down or stop or respond. You just keep on going. And it's an everyday thing in many big cities and small cities probably as well.
This would happen back in our small town occasionally, but certainly in bigger cities, it's a much more, common thing.
A sheltered, homeschooled Texas teenager is accused of shooting to death both of his parents. A teenager from Frisco, Texas is accused of murdering both of his parents. According to DallasNews.com, the 16-year-old was, quote, very sheltered and was being homeschooled by parents who desired to keep him shielded from the real world. The teenage gunman was one of 2 school-age children left at home out of 5. The deceased, Ryan Callens, 48, and Maria Elena Callens, 49, had 3 other adult children. Frisco police officer Chad Laprelle said to Dallas Morning News that officers responded to a 911 call around 2 a.m. Monday reporting gunshots. Both Callan's parents were dead of gunshot wounds when police arrived. Their 16-year-old son was taken into custody. Police have not released the boy's name. Now, Jonathan Markham, who's a 15-year-old friend of the accused killer, told the Morning News, quote, "He was very sheltered. If he broke the guidelines, he got punished. He was not allowed to drink sodas or watch R-rated films. He was only allowed access to PG-13 films once a screening agency edited out any violent or adult-themed scenes. He was only allowed to be on the internet under very close supervision." We know, Lewis, from study after study after study, that authoritarian parenting not only typically leads to, more likely leads to conservatism, but it also is just bad for the kids. And shielding your children from the realities of life also seems to be a really, really bad thing. And I think sex education is very representative of this in general.
Another interesting point here is that this is just one individual anecdote, of course, but I guess exposure to violent movies and video games does not necessarily make you more violent. Perhaps that violence is predisposed.
When parents go to such lengths to limit their child's connection to the real world, first of all, there often is some kind of abuse going on, right? At the very least, it's psychological abuse, indoctrination, either religious or otherwise. But further, what's the expectation of what will happen once the child is an adult? Is the idea that you're going to keep the child sheltered forever? If you're not, the encounter with the real world, the introduction to the real world, will be all the more tragic, dramatic, and damaging if the child has been kept completely sheltered until age 18 or 20 or 21 or however long you can keep the child under your control.
Only parents with a skewed view of the real world themselves would think that this makes sense. So I think everyone involved is pretty messed up here.
Give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. Also follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpakman. We'll talk to Brad Friedman after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by investigative reporter and journalist Brad Friedman. You can check out his website, bradblog.com. Brad, you and I seem to have a conversation every couple years about voter suppression. We talk about all of the initiatives designed to, as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, make it more difficult disproportionately for likely Democratic voters to cast votes. Is my characterization wrong?
Your characterization is actually perfect. That's the idea behind all of these voter suppression laws that we're seeing passed all across the country since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act last year, but even beforehand. I mean, this has been a strategy that's been going on for at least the last decade by Republicans who are looking at the demographics, seeing what they're facing, and realizing that at this point, the best way, and perhaps the only way in many cases, to win elections is to keep people from voting. People, specifically who might otherwise vote Democratic. Yeah, absolutely. That's what's going on.
So give me your assessment as far as the kind of line of reasoning that I'm going through in my mind. I see the demographic shifts that you talk about. It becomes abundantly clear that it's going to be really difficult for Republicans to win with this strategy that depends primarily on white voters. So I say to myself, well, they could also just change their positions to make the platform more palatable to minority and likely Democratic voters. They're not doing that. Is it because they don't care? Is it because the Republican insiders wouldn't allow it? Is the party so inherently xenophobic that they can't even conceive of that? In other words, wouldn't it be pragmatic to just change the platform?
Well, of course, that's what reasonable people would do. The Republican Party at this time is not reasonable. They are crippled. They are crippled by themselves. They are crippled by their Tea Party. You saw after the 2012 election, they had their autopsy and they said, okay, the party needs to change. We've got to deal with immigration. We've got to deal with this and that. they have dealt with none of it other than becoming more extreme at the things that have caused them to lose elections in the first place. So this is a broken party. So, instead of doing what you're talking about, David, which would be reasonable, reach out to voters to make them want to vote for you. Apparently, it's just easier to, reach out with their laws to keep people from voting for their opposition. I mean, it's really sad. It's really pathetic. It's very disturbing that the courts have now, in many cases, thanks to the Supreme Court, made this so easy for them to do. There's still going to be a battle in court, and there are still a lot of, I would say, good news, victories to be won here. I think when they get down really to brass tacks on things like polling place photo ID restrictions, I don't believe that those will be upheld at the Supreme Court. I know a lot of people disagree with me, but we've got our legal analyst at bradblog.com, Ernest Canning, has looked at the various decisions on this throughout the years. And his analysis is that these laws won't stand up even to the right-wing Supreme Court. That said, there's all sorts of tricks that can be done, shortening early voting periods, making it more difficult to register. We're seeing that happening in spades in North Carolina. So, it's still a long fight. And you mentioned, one of the problems is we talk about this every few years. We should be talking about it constantly because voting and democracy are at the very heart of everything that we do. And all of the problems that you're seeing right now across the country, from Ferguson, Missouri, to what's going on overseas, all of that depends on democracy. It depends on our vote, depends on our ability to toss out the bums at the voting booth. But if you wait until just before the election to do anything about it, good luck. So this is a fight that needs to be going on all the time. And as always, I'm glad to talk to you because you seem to be paying attention.
Well, yeah, I mean, Brad, there's no question at all that I, like you, recognize the importance of this and of voting. My concern is this, and I hope that you have some optimistic words to give me when I tell you this. Every couple of weeks, we are now getting either a study, an analysis, etc., that shows us that actually, regardless of who is voted into office, particularly at the national level and the state level, there's very little connection between the policy desires of the average American voter and the policy that is eventually enacted. Now, if you're a very rich person, an economic elite, or a big corporation, a lobbying organization, your desires are far more likely to be represented by elected officials. So I'm so kind of bummed out, I guess, to put it colloquially, because we're working so hard to expose the voter suppression. But even if we can combat that, the policy desires of the average American are rarely actually reflected.
Let's see if I can offer you some good thoughts there.
Please.
Yes, I know. We need some good news this summer. Look, there are certain politicians out there that I suspect you like, that I suspect are more progressive, much more progressive than others.
Yeah.
There are certain politicians that you probably hate on one issue, love on other issues. Democracy, doesn't happen overnight. Even if everyone who wants to vote gets to vote tomorrow and all of their votes actually get to be counted publicly so we know they're counted accurately, things don't change for the better overnight. It's a long game. It's a long fight. And so, this is the problem. A lot of people think they turn out during a presidential election. They don't have to worry about off-year elections. They turn out at a presidential election. They cast their vote. Oh, everything's going to be great from here. No, it's not. It does not work that way. It's a continuing fight. This is something, by the way, the Republican Party has figured out. Even with this stupid internecine battle between the Tea Party and the establishment Republicans, what that party has realized is that if they want their version of their right-wing policies to move forward, they have to get in there, they have to fight, they have to primary their candidates and make sure that they get somebody who's not just doesn't have an R by the name, but actually represents whatever they believe in, no matter how twisted it may be in some regards on the right. I would suggest that progressives need to do the same thing. It's not enough to have a candidate with a D by their name. You got to get in there and fight for the candidates that you like and hold your Democrats accountable when they don't do what you want them to do. And by the way, you have to keep fighting in order to get those people in so that they can, in turn, help change the court system, which has a great effect on all of this. So yeah, I think a lot of people think it's going to be, it's supposed to be something that's easy overnight, that you vote once and everything works out grand in the morning. No, it doesn't. It is a continuing and long fight. But I think victories are being won all the time as long as we stay participating instead of throwing up our hands and giving up.
So in the last minute or so that we have here, when it comes to take it back to voter suppression and these voter ID laws that are supposedly meant to prevent the rampant problem of voter fraud, which essentially doesn't exist, right? We have such few cases of this. What can the average person do to activate around this issue? Is it a matter of calling someone? Is it a matter of writing a letter, a petition? What can people do?
Well, to be clear, voter fraud does exist, not in a huge way, and certainly not in the way that the Republicans are pretending that it exists. They are pretending, to be clear, they're pretending that there is this massive in-person voter fraud going on where people show up at the polls pretending to be someone else. That is incredibly rare, almost never happens. One expert who's been following it now for a long, long time found 31 potential, maybe possible incidents out of 1 billion votes cast over the past 14 years. Literally. So, that's just a charade. So what can people do to do something about it? They can stay involved. They can pay attention to what's going on. They can raise holy hell about it. They can hold people accountable. When you see these Tea Partiers running around talking about, freedom and liberty and fighting for rights, they can say, okay, that's great, Tea Party. How about the right to vote? Will you join me with your big guns to fight for that? Or do we only sit around and support scofflaw ranchers in Nevada when they steal government land? So staying involved, not giving up, not despairing, no matter how ugly it gets, and it's getting really ugly and despairing, I do understand. But stay positive, stay informed, and keep up the good fight. That's all we can do, I think, in a democracy.
We've been speaking with investigative journalist Brad Friedman. Check out bradblog.com. Brad, pleasure as always, and we'll of course have you back and keep talking about this.
Always great to talk to you, David. Thanks, man.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Do you remember Republican Congressman from Nebraska, Lee Terry? He's that guy who never seems to be particularly happy with the congressional salary. In this case, it's the $174,000 annual salary for members of Congress. He is responding to his challenger's proposal that congressional salaries be cut by 10% by saying that actually they should be raised because it hasn't been increased since 2008. Lee Terry is upset that congressional salaries have not been increased since 2008. Of course, concurrently, Lee Terry has voted against increasing the minimum wage multiple times. It is amazing to me that if you make $174,000 a year, you think it makes more sense to increase your salary rather than that of someone who is working full-time at minimum wage and making $15,000 a year. What a guy, huh?
Maybe it's trickle-down economics, right? If you give this guy another $25,000 a year, that means what? He'll create jobs and more poor people will get more money?
What he's also ignoring, not only the absurdity of that, Lewis, is that if you consider the median household income was flat during the 1980s and the 1990s, and it actually dropped nearly $4,000 during the 2000 decade. It's just incredible. I still think that it's not a crazy idea to explore that members of Congress or elected officials have a salary that is based on the median income within their district. And their district could be defined differently, right? For a senator, I guess it's the entire state. For a member of Congress, maybe it's their specific district. So for example, maybe the multiple is 1.25. So if the median income in your district is $50,000, then you can make no more than $62,500. Or maybe the multiple is 1.5. Thus, if the median income is $60,000, you can make no more than $90,000. I feel like we would see public policy switch overnight if that were the case. Highly unlikely that big lobbyists and corporations would ever allow such a system.
They'd never allow it. These politicians will never change the system that nets them $174,000 a year. But there are some countries, I think there's a Scandinavian country that does this with their businesses, where no one in the business, including the CEO, can make more than something like 10 or 12 times the lowest paid employee. And it seems to work pretty well.
It has still allowed for very high salaries for the top executives. It has just brought up those lower salaries in order to allow for it. It's a pretty interesting concept. Doesn't seem like it's going to be happening anytime soon in this country, though.
No, it's not going to happen probably ever.
Okay, so there it is. Lee Terry, he wants more money, but he votes no for minimum wage increases. I want to talk about something that happened to me over the weekend. If you... depending on where you live, depending on how much you travel, you probably have instances where you either talk to or are approached or at least see or walk by people who are panhandling. And if you're like most people, if you're like me, you've developed a pretty good shield or insulation to this. So even when you see people who clearly look like they truly do need money, you still resist. You feel that you can successfully walk by without feeling too guilty. And the same is the case for me. In New York City, you have people on the subway who are trying to sell stuff or playing a guitar and asking for money. You see parents who will panhandle with their children and have their children help the panhandling, probably astutely figuring out that people are more likely to give if they see a child. You see people with animals, often people panhandling with dogs, and that often makes people say, oh, you know what? It's not the dog's fault that their owner is homeless or doesn't have money. And still, you build up a pretty good tolerance to it. But the other day, I was walking along East Houston in Manhattan, and I was walking behind a couple of individuals who seemed to be tourists. Maybe they were from the city, but they seemed to be tourists. And there was a man who was asking them for money. And at first, the interactions were very much where the panhandler was kind of putting on a show in a sense, right? In other words, trying to do something funny or interesting or different to stand out so that these two individuals might give him some money. And the individuals made it clear that they weren't going to. And then the guy, who was probably, I don't know, a 45 or 50-year-old guy, just kind of stops and he drops his head, and the playing a character, the being a performer thing, the trying to do something cute for $1 part stopped. And the guy just looked totally dejected. And he looked at them and he said, I'm so hungry, y'all. And kind of just looked down. And it really got to me, Lewis. And I thought about it just all night and in the days since. And putting aside the issue of poverty and homelessness and just focusing in on this issue of hunger, right? It's sickening that, as you've told us, Lewis, when you worked at a grocery store, the amount of perfectly good food that at the end of the day was thrown out simply because by the next day, the produce might be overripe, or because it was one day past its expiration, but still perfectly good, is just incredible. I mean, you could feed the homeless with the amount of food that grocery stores throw out. And we just haven't figured out a system to prevent that, right? Someone who, put aside the fact that they're homeless, they don't have a job, they're poor, I'm so hungry, y'all, right? It just really got to me.
Figure out a system like this is difficult, like this is complicated. There's nothing to figure out. We just can't do it because of our legal system, because of our corporate system, because of our politicians. That's the reason.
Right. The criminalization of feeding the homeless in some cities, as we've seen.
Well, it's just a mess. It's all a big mess. And I was shocked at the amount of food one store was throwing out. And if you take every supermarket in the country that is, part of a corporate chain, or even the small ones, I'm sure, I can't even imagine. I can't even fathom the amount of food being thrown out.
There's just no reason for this, right? Being that upset about just being hungry is an optional problem. Not optional to this poor guy, but it's certainly optional when it comes to our politicians, and we just have to do something about it. 219-2-DAVID-P is the voicemail number for the show. Call anytime. Here's a voicemail commenting on the Christian CEO soliciting dog sex on Craigslist.
Hey, David. This is the Honest Economist. That was a great story you did last night about Jerry Hill, the Baptist CEO who allegedly tried to find a dog to have sex with. This proves the religious freaks were right when they said if gay marriage is legalized, it will lead to bestiality.
Right, yeah, no, that's funny. This guy probably against gay marriage, and there he is all of a sudden trying to have sex with a dog. Of course, what they meant, I think, though, is that bestiality, zoophilia, will be legalized, which is, of course, a very, very different proposition. We have a great bonus show planned for you today. Google is funding the next-gen undersea and trans-Pacific cable. Pittsburgh police, or rather the Pittsburgh airport, is going to allow fracking underneath it. Is this a good idea? And how to get away with stealing over $100,000 worth of whiskey. Those stories and more on today's bonus show. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to become a member and get access to the world-famous bonus show hosted by producer Lewis.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.